Throughout the year, there has been a ton of fierce competitors all thriving to get that #1 spot, dethroning Dead by Daylight as the #1 asymmetrical horror game, ultimately with everything becoming the same result, failing at getting that #1 spot. But why is that? Why is it so difficult for games to even exist in the same genre as Dead by Daylight, and will there ever be a game that does it properly? Well, I've excessively researched this, and I've boiled it down to 3 main reasons why these games ultimately fail. And before we can jump on into those 3 reasons, we need to take a look and give credit to what Dead by Daylight has done and what they've done correctly. So let's break that down. Dead by Daylight was one of the first games in its genre to do it right, an asymmetrical game that pins players against players in a mode that seemed unrealistic. You have 1 killer going against 4 survivors, and some way, somehow, they managed to make it work. A game mode like this had never existed before, and from its initial release, people absolutely loved it. From the game devs themselves, in the first day, they exceeded the amount of sales they thought they would get in their lifetime of Dead by Daylight, and absolutely blew away everybody with what a magnificent game Dead by Daylight was. It wasn't long before they capitalized on this success with a licensed chapter, pretty much unknowing to them, solidifying their foundation in this genre for years and years to come, with Halloween and Michael Myers along with Laurie Strode joining the fog. From this point on, they continued to induct very iconic characters such as Freddy Krueger and Leatherface. And once again, this got more eyes onto the game and further solidifying that solid foundation to what we now know as Dead by Daylight. So credit is due right here. They've come out with a brand new game in a genre that we've never seen before. They adapted some of the most iconic horror characters that we've ever seen and bringing in so many licenses into their game, which many games even to this date fail to do. With the exceptions of Fortnite and Call of Duty, there isn't really a lot of games that capitalize on bringing in these big licenses. And since Dead by Daylight is such a niche game in this horror genre, it works perfectly. And this was one of the reasons why they catapulted so quickly for their success, not to mention the excessive coverage they got on YouTube, working with content creators to bring their items into the game, ensuring people got to see the game, and it was at a reasonably cheap price point as well, so it was very easy for people to pick up and get going. From this point on, they quickly adapted and they became a strong game. They hired more people, they fixed bugs, they constantly put out new updates, and eventually they got on track. They started doing community posts, dev updates, and they showed their passion for the game. And years to come, they are now in a very routine, kind of big company standard of going on consistently, doing all the right PR things, and while there are ups and downs with Dead by Daylight, they have solidified themselves as the #1 asymmetrical game there is. But even for behavior, they can't even replicate the success that they have on Dead by Daylight. Let's take for instance Death Garden, a game that they've created, and their first iteration thinking maybe we could capitalize on this once again, doing that same 1v4 asymmetrical type of game, bringing in a big license with the Terminator coming in, but that game ultimately ended up failing. So why is it that even Behavior, the creators of the most popular game in this asymmetrical genre, can't even replicate the success that Dead by Daylight has? Well, to me, it boils down to 3 major points and 1 extra if you want to count it. And for me, these 3, you can pretty much blanket over any competitor for Dead by Daylight, and if you take a look at them, most of the times, if a game doesn't have one of these, they're likely to fail. The first one is content, in the sense of creating new content consistently, as well as fixing content that already exists in the game. Having a consistent schedule of updating bugs, updating things that need to be changed, and ensuring balances in the game, making players want to play more, as well as bringing in new content consistently in order to keep those players playing. The next thing is player satisfaction, and this is in regards of a grind system. This is in regards of cosmetics that are reasonably priced as well, that people can customize and feel that this character is their character. This also in turn deals with balancing, but not so much as the first point. The final point is uniqueness, being your own thing and not copying what the other competitors do. having something different that really hooks onto players that might appeal in the same genre but isn't necessarily the same, because why play a bad off-brand when you can have the real deal? And the final extra point that's a little bit of a caveat that goes at the end is major balancing when it comes down to one side, specifically the survivor side. So before we dive on into these major points and take a look at how games can successfully do this and what games ultimately didn't, we need to remember one thing as well. When there's a new asymmetrical game that is going to come out, chances are they're going to get flooded and flooded and flooded with new players testing it out for the first time. Because when there's zero competition with Dead by Daylight at this point in time, everybody's going to take a look at the new competitor on the block, and everybody that's been kind of burnt out from Dead by Daylight will absolutely love it for its initial week of the new honeymoon phase. This is a new game, this is interesting, this is fun, until it boils down to one of those three problems. I want to start off talking about one of Dead by Daylight's biggest competitors, at least in my eye, Phasmophobia. Initially, Phasmophobia did a fantastic job. Unlike previous competitors that I'm sure you could think of, they did something that was unique. They didn't do the classic 4v1 asymmetrical that just kind of feels like Dead by Daylight with a twist on it. They made it where you and your friends basically hunt and exercise a ghost. This was really good. This was one of the games that I thought would truly compete with Dead by Daylight, as it still brings in the same players from that horror genre into their own game, and they've done it well. The game was so unique, it was super fun, and during that first month or so of that initial honeymoon phase, as I like to call it, everybody enjoyed it. But where did they go wrong? If we take a look at the list, in my eyes is definitely the 1 and the 2 category. They didn't have a big enough team to fix the bugs that were ongoing, as well as creating new content. I mean, take a look at how long it took us to just get some new content into the game. Even up to now, they're finally now putting in some content where you're getting some new maps, you're having a little bit sense of a grind, and they didn't necessarily even know where to go with this, because there's been so many updates where they've pretty much wiped your entire account, brought things back. It's been a whole mess, and this has been ongoing for a very long time. And the other section of this is player satisfaction. For me, when I played Phasmophobia, literally 2 weeks into it, after playing on the hardest difficulty, I had enough money to buy everything 50 times over. So there was no sense of a grind besides of just playing the game to play the game, and since there was no grind, it was kind of pointless. I just played with my friends, and at a point it got boring because we got so good at the game that there realistically was no sense of a grind. So when no new content coming out for me to explore, ongoing bugs that are always there, and no sense of grind, I quickly put Phasmophobia down, just like many players. Now, while they're still doing good and they have about a 10,000 average on Steam, this is nothing compared to what they used to have and what they potentially could have had. And they have done something that a lot of these other games just don't necessarily get right, and that's being unique. Doing something correct, something that still attracts that asymmetrical fan base, that horror Dead by Daylight fan base, but doing something that's so different that you don't just feel like it's a Dead by Daylight ripoff. I want to take a look at one of the newest competitors that ultimately failed as well, and that is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They done everything right leading up to this, until a few points happen. They knew they had something cooking. They knew something was good. They knew that they were going to get tons and tons of players coming in from Dead by Daylight to try out their game. They had a huge following over on social media, and the idea and the concept was unique. It was a 3v4. It was completely different from anything we've seen before. While demanding for a lot of killers, it was still something that I was willing to try. They had their own progression system, so you had that sense of grind, and it seemed that they had a good amount of content lined up with multiple different killers and the expectation that more new content was going to come. So what went wrong with them? Well, let's break it down to those 3 points as well. Turns out when the game actually came out, there was no new content for a very, very long time. And this one was really shocking to me because I honestly thought TCM was going to do very good, and so did many other people. And I think even the devs kind of knew that this game was going to do pretty good. Gun Interactive, their second time around making a fantastic game, ultimately didn't have a lot of new content ready to go. So a lot of that huge initial success people didn't eventually play. They figured there's nothing new to play, let's just move on until they bring in new content. And when they did bring in new content, it was at a ridiculous price point that was slapped hugely in your face. So that player satisfaction category went down as well. Not to mention the ongoing balance issues and bugs, and the devs flat out saying that they're not balancing necessarily for competitive play, but they're more so balancing for fun play. And while that's fine and dandy, it made it so that the players that were playing very competitively would just absolutely pummel everybody. So this could be on either side, which leads to a lot of people being very discouraged and then not wanting to play the game. So while they weren't balancing for competitive, eventually a lot of those major things were stuck in the game and players eventually left. The next big issue that they have, which also touches on the last category, which is a bit of a caveat as I mentioned, is that there weren't a lot of killer players. And I want to break this one down for you guys because you might notice that a lot of the games that include this thing that I'm about to say tend to fail, and that is the survivors fighting back. Now I know this might be a little bit of a hot take, but realistically, think about it for a second. Let's take a look at Dead by Daylight. Killers often do complain about flashlights, they complain about flashlight saves, they complain about locker saves, whatever the case may be, pallets, etc. This is something where you as a killer going against 4 players want to feel like you have the power and the control. And the way the game is meant to be balanced is that it's likely you're going to get 2 kills and 2 people are going to escape. When this does not happen, it's likely that you played a poor game or some of these other factors came into consideration and these survivors are playing excessively well. How do the survivors play excessively well? They use pallets, they get flashlight saves, they do these things that allow them to fight back against the killer. In certain games that give survivors even more so the power to fight against killers, like TCM, like Home Sweet Home, like Last Year, and the list goes on and on, once you run into that first bully squad that really knows what they're doing and how to capitalize on using stuns effectively or whatever the case may be to really take advantage of that killer, the chances are that killer is not going to play the game for a very long time after running into multiple squads like that, unless you are top tier good, which in most cases that's not the case. So with that discouragement, that killer is going to think that the game is incredibly imbalanced and fall into the same way that Dead by Daylight has the killer versus survivor main. And with little to no changes and the fact that this is now a fundamental of the game where survivors can pretty much beat the shit out of the killer, there's not going to be a lot of killers remaining. Think about it this way, a game like Friday the 13th, which is long gone, still gets players on console, everybody playing together because survivors want to play. You want to play with your friends. So someone just becomes a killer, everybody else is a survivor, and you go in rotation. So no matter what, at the end of the day, there will be survivors that are playing the game. So unfortunately for survivors, you do have to balance a little bit around the killer to make them at least feel that they have some sort of power. While it's super fun and super entertaining to play with your Swift, to play with your friends, and to go around basically murking all the killers, on the killer side, if you're getting this consistently, you're not playing that game a lot. And take a look at every single game that has a mechanic like this where you're able to fight back. Ultimately, they all end up failing, especially more so when fighting back is a major mechanic and a major thing that you can do. I digress with this point, that is just the other caveat that we mentioned, but looking back at TCM, with the lack of no content, the consistent bugs, and the fact that you could consistently fight against the killers, eventually that killer main population started to deplete. People didn't want to play Leatherface, people wanted to play the stronger characters, and eventually it took them a very long time. They made it so that you didn't have to play certain characters, but it was all but too late. So when boiling it down, these 3 major points, if they're not satisfied, the chances are the game isn't necessarily going to do good. So what can a game do in order to try to at least replicate some success? Well, obviously you need to have something unique. You need to have something that still fits this asymmetrical horror scene, maybe like a Phasmophobia, maybe it is something that is a 4v1, but something that's different from the competition. By no chance do you want to play a game that pretty much feels and plays just like Dead by Daylight. That's not Dead by Daylight. They just have a monopoly at this point with all of the licenses that they do have, so you need to be unique in a different way. you can no longer capitalize on these big licenses because they have them all. So you need to come up with something that's unique to yourself. Phasmophobia did a good job at this, other games not so much. Next, you need to expect that you probably will get a decent amount of players coming in. So at the very minimum, don't get your ego too inflated, but think about, okay, if I have 1,000 to 10,000 players playing this game, how do I keep them playing? How do I keep them occupied? How do I keep them wanting more? And that is a sense of grind, maybe a few cosmetics in there that are inexpensive or free that you can obtain to really show off to your friends that, hey, I put the time and effort into this game, look what I just got. And you need to have new content planned very early. Not to mention another team, if possible, to fix these bugs. Now, obviously, I'm not silly. Starting off, you're not going to have a huge team working with you. You might just be a one-person operation. So obviously, if the glove fits, you need to do something like this. So for example, a game like Phasmophobia that sold millions of copies in its first week, you definitely can afford to get some new players coming in if you want that longevity of the game to continue. Now again, it's not as easy as that, it is not that black and white, and obviously game devs know that, but it's definitely something to think about and have in the back of your mind once you have that option available. So if you have a team that's dedicated to bugs, you have a team that's dedicated to new content, you have a unique experience, what do you do to continue that game's success? Well, the last part is consistency. You need to keep on putting new content. You need to keep on working on these bugs, get on a schedule, and let players know that this is our roadmap, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to do it. We are open to some of your suggestions, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Having that transparency, giving players a voice to say what they want will be huge. And quite frankly, a lot of games don't even make it to this stage. It always stops where there's too much bugs, there's lack of new content, there's no sense of grind, and that's where the line stops. And for the games that do go over this hurdle, like Phasmophobia, sometimes it really is too late, even with their major updates that are coming out now that pretty much reset all of the items, reset everybody's points, and they're like, okay, we're taking a fresh start, we're trying something new, we have new content. It's a little bit too late to capitalize on an audience that you once had, because chances are people are going to put down that game and play something else, maybe Demonologists, maybe Manor Lords, whatever the case may be. But there you go, that is my rant pretty much over. Can I make a successful game? Probably not, but those are definitely some points that can help and amplify some of these games have a better run at competing with Dead by Daylight. At the end of the day, I wish there is a game that truly competes with Dead by Daylight. Competition is great, not only for Dead by Daylight, but for the new game and for players. Everybody wins in this situation. Will we ever get a game like that? Well, we have to see. And try my theory out. Do these 3 points apply to a game that you think can compete with Dead by Daylight? If you can find a game that pretty much satisfies all 3 of these points, I can almost guarantee you that game will do good. But I haven't really seen any game that does that yet. So until then, we wait for Dead by Daylight's competition. And there you go. I hope you guys enjoyed this rant. It was a little bit all over the place because I didn't really have a script. That's how all of these videos are in the second channel, but something I've been wanting to talk about for a very long time. I might have a future video that dives into more in-depth why these games didn't necessarily do good, why even behavior games didn't do good, and we can take a look at all of that. But until then, that's gonna do it for today's video. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure you leave a like down below. On the next video, we'll have the winner for the DLC giveaway code. And as always, I'm the King. I tip my crown to you guys, and we'll see you in the fog.